So, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you joining us from the West Coast. Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Victoria Becker, and I will be your host for today's session. This webinar is brought to you by the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, the only global qualifying organization in Canada where you can become a chartered governance professional. For further information about our programs, webinars, or events, I invite you to visit our website, which is at www.cgiofcanada.ca. Now, before we begin the presentation, please note that everyone has been muted, but if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function or note them in the chat and we can flag them for the speakers. Just a quick note, we do have a designated Q&A section of the presentation later in the presentation, so we do invite you to get your questions ready for the panel so that we can answer as many as possible during this section of the presentation. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our panel of speakers today, Shona McGlashan, Annie Laurenson, and our moderator, Isobel O'Connell, who will be presenting on Purpose and Practice, the Evolving Role of Governance Professionals. Shona is the principal of McGlashan Consulting Inc., bringing over 25 years of senior experience in value-based governance, EDI leadership, and workplace well-being. She is also a fellow of the Chartered Governance Institute and was named Canada's 2023 Governance Professional of the Year. Annie is the Senior Director, Governance and Corporate Secretary at Vicuna Corp, with an extensive governance career across BHP, Lundin Mining, BMO, and multiple TSX-listed companies. She is also recognized as a leader in diversity and inclusion and was named one of Canada's top 100 Black women to watch in 2023 by Canada International Black Women Excellence. And Isobel is an international ESG leader with 20 years of experience helping organizations turn complex sustainability and risk challenges into business value. She's a strategic partner at Metagnosis Consulting. She has been recognized globally, including as one of Sustainability X magazine's top 50 women in sustainability. So you're in very good hands today. With all of that, I would like to pass it over to Shona for our land acknowledgement.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Hi, everybody. I'm Shona, and welcome to our webinar today. And let's begin. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations that you might not otherwise know as Vancouver, BC. As you can tell, as soon as I start speaking, I'm an immigrant here. And I'm very grateful to be living here, working here, and raising my family in this beautiful place. And so today I want to share a learning with you that I learned from Jared Kwatsalatsum Williams, who is a language teacher and an expert in Indigenous food sources. And one of the things I learned from him is about the month of December. Now, Hunkaminam is the language that is spoken by the Musqueam and other Coast Salish nations along the coast here in what is now Canada and the United States. And in Hunkaminam, the word for December, we find ourselves in December, is Shulwatsum. Shulwatsum. And in Hunkaminam, the word for December means the time for putting away your paddles. Because the Coast Salish nations were and are seafaring peoples. They use the roads, they use the sea here, the Salish Sea, as their highways, as their travel between communities and places for gathering and for gathering food and so on. But December Shulwatsum is a time of storms and snow and short days and darkness. So it's a time for putting away your paddles. And which reminds me very much of, in my own ancestral language, Gaelic, the word for December is Andulach, which means literally the blackness, the darkness. So December is a time for, as we say in Scotland, currying in, cozying in, pausing, reflecting. For the Coast Salish people, a time for putting your paddles away and staying home and reflecting. So I'd invite you all to reflect on the place that you're in today, the gratitude and the debt you owe to the custodians of that land, and also how, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, how you will use December as a time to put your paddle away and reflect and stay put rather than faring out into the world. Thank you. Back to you, Victoria. Oh, and one more thing. I'm going to put Jared Kwatsanachum's website in the chat because if you want to follow somebody to learn more about Indigenous languages and Indigenous food sources, he's a great person to learn from.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And I'm going to pass it right over to Isobel.
Well, thank you, both of you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this conversation. Like it is a webinar, but I want to make sure that we're interacting as much as possible because embedding purpose, there's new roles for all sorts of governance professionals. So as governance professionals, you sit in the intersection of compliance, culture, and strategy, which makes you natural enablers of purpose. So today we will explore how we can strengthen the connection between governance, trust, and social impact, and highlight practical ways to make it into the boardroom and stay in the boardroom. It's an easy point of entry, but it's not always clear, but it can be practical, but it's also grounded in the real work of governance. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, well, what is purpose-led governance? What does it mean? Well, it's the board of directors. They're actively overseeing the company's core reason for existing. So it's purpose. It's beyond just profits. It's acting as a compass for navigating risks and opportunities, especially during these turbulent times that we find ourselves in. It involves ensuring purpose isn't just talk, because I'm sure we've heard of all sorts of washing, and there is now purpose washing, but it's lived out in capital allocation, risk management, talent attraction, and guiding a company's path to fostering genuine impact. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we have a very packed agenda, and I want to make sure that we stay on task. But at the same time, please, as Victoria did say, put your questions in the chat and the comments, because our speakers will be checking in on that occasionally. And if not, we will get to your questions during the Q&A section. Next slides, please. So why does purpose matter? In every boardroom, people talk about the CEO. They talk about the chair. They talk about the director. But who is the quiet force that keeps the entire governance machine stable, compliant, and functional? Well, it's the governance professionals. And sometimes they're not even in the boardroom. They're in the back room, making sure that the cooking and cleaning is all taking place. But there's a large spotlight that's shining on corporate action these days. And this is where the governance professional comes in. And they deal with the stakeholders and the growing expectations. So boards are being challenged to lead with purpose because it needs to align to profit and positive impact, stakeholder regulations, and investors are asking not just what a company can do, but how they can do it and who with. It's also about strengthening trust, resilience, and reputation because boards are becoming thought leaders as well. And governance is what turns intention into accountability. So it's the anchor, but it's also the bridge between what the company stands for and how it behaves. Next slide, please. So practical ways to embed purpose. So here are 5 simple but powerful ways to embed purpose in governance. Number 1, strengthening frameworks. Bake the purpose into your bylaws, charters, and KPIs. Number 2, shape agendas. Well, make social impact and stakeholder value reoccurring topics. Number 3, build capability. Equip boards with skills to govern for ESG and impact. That's where training comes into play, and it's so important for all board members. Enhance disclosure. Connect strategy and purpose to tell a clear, credible story about the purpose. And number 5, my favorite, fostering culture, because aligning everyday behaviors with the organization's stated values, it doesn't mean that you just list them. It means that you scenario plan around them. You strategize about them. But none of this can happen overnight. But small, consistent steps change how the board thinks and ultimately how it leads. Next slide, please. So governance professionals as purpose enablers, lots of names, lots of titles. And our speakers will go into that a little bit later on. But governance professionals are often misunderstood. Their titles alone can be flip-flopping back and forth. And most have said that they have felt undervalued in the boardroom at some time. Yet they're absolutely central to strong governance and long-term corporate performance. That's why they're becoming more strategic than ever. So they're not just administrators, they're advisors, architects, not in the physical sense, they're integrators, and they're custodians. Their influence lies in the quiet power of governance and the loud as well. But I see it more in the quiet because they show how the agenda is being shared, shaped, and the information, and of course, the tone. So I was recently told a boardroom truth, and I'm happy to share it with all of you today. So the CEO leads the organization, the chair leads the board, but the governance professionals hold the governance system together. They're the glue. So underrate them, and it weakens the entire enterprise. Empower them, and you strengthen the company's long-term resilience, integrity, and purpose. Now, let's hand this over to our panelists, two experienced governance leaders who bring deep insights from practice. Next slide, and Shona, please. Shona.
Okay, thank you so much, Isobel. And let's move on to the next slide and take away that rather old photo that I need to update. So I wanted to talk to you all because we have an audience here of governance professionals, and I want to acknowledge that there's a huge amount of wisdom in this room, right? So we have, I guess, getting on for 75 governance professionals in the room, many of whom have got years or decades of experience, who've been thoughtful and proactive about values and the ethical aspects of the governance professional's role, but acting as the organizational's conscience. So I really would invite you to drop your comments in the chat, to unmute yourself and ask a question. We'll have Q&A at the end, but I'm also happy to take questions as we go. And I've only got 3 short slides for you, so I just wanted to give you a kind of an overview of my experience. So why do we bring purpose into the boardroom? Well, partly because I truly believe that all organizations should be doing something to make the world a better place, that organizations shouldn't just be there to increase shareholder value, which is about making rich people richer. And I count us all probably within the world's successful rich elite, right? But organizations should be doing more than making people who already are, well resourced, even better resourced. And organizations should have a social purpose, some way of understanding how are you going to leave the world a better place than you found it? What does your business really contribute to the well-being of humans, the well-being of the planet, the good of our communities, and so on? But one of the ways you can bring purpose into the boardroom is just in terms of, you see that Isobel and I both use this idea of a compass in our slides, this idea of defining a true north, cutting through the noise for boards, because we know, right? So in the 2025 Ernst & Young survey of directors, we heard that 35% of directors think that the current model of governance is not sustainable because of the workload, and particularly the compliance workload that is put on boards. But the immense number of risks, the polycrisis in the world, the things that boards are having to juggle with. So 35% of directors think that the current model is not sustainable. And a further 47% think that it is only partially sustainable. So you've probably seen, I've certainly seen, that boards are kind of buckling under the pressure. Boards have so much to do, agendas are so full, they're often full of non-value add regulatory and compliance matters that don't fully tap into the wisdom of the board. And boards, no board I have ever spoken to says it spends enough time on strategy and strategic matters and foresight, right? So one of the things that purpose can really do is help cut down the noise in the boardroom. by helping the board focus on what's truly important for the organization, what's truly material, where the challenges and the opportunities and the risks lie, and to be able to assess how well the organization is fulfilling its purpose. And I will say what I have seen about purpose is I find purpose to be more meaningful as an organizational direction than values. Right. So I'm going to give you two organizations here that both have value statements. Organization one, its four values are integrity, innovation, responsibility, reconciliation. Okay, four things that we would all support, right? Integrity, innovation, responsibility, reconciliation. Organization two, their four values are integrity, inclusion, responsibility, and empathy. Integrity, inclusion, responsibility, and empathy. So those two organizations have 50% of their values are the same. They both value integrity and responsibility. And then one holds up for innovation and reconciliation, the other inclusion and empathy. Those two organizations are working in exactly the same sector, doing very similar work, but have entirely different corporate structures. And the values don't tell you anything about that. So one of them is Vancity, Canada's largest credit union. And in fact, these are both organizations that your panelists have worked for. The other one is BMO, one of our largest banks here in Canada. So they're both financial institutions providing financial services for people in business and trying to do it in a way that is, has integrity, is responsible, and so on. And we would all support that. But the reason those organizations were created is entirely different. Vancity is a co-op, is a credit union, was built to drive member need. It's owned by its members in a way that BMO has a different, entirely different corporate structure. And the values of an organization don't really reflect that. And just to give you an example, here's a third one: passion, respect, integrity, collaboration. Right? Passion, respect, integrity, collaboration. Well, that's a furniture manufacturer, so wholly different. And again, that doesn't give you real insight into what an organization is doing and why, but purpose gives you the why. And so here's some really some ways that you as the governance professional can thread purpose into board conversations through the education and development, help the board understand why purpose is important. If your organization doesn't have a purpose statement already, bring some people in to help you build that. Through your offsite, how are you threading purpose into your offsite? Through your evaluation, does the board understand purpose? Is the board holding purpose-related conversations? Is it moving purpose forward? And through reporting and information flows, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, we were all saying, all of us as governance professionals, saying in our board reporting, we need to outline how does this relate to our strategy? Put it in your report. How does it relate to the strategy? Make it really clear. But now it's like, how does it relate to our strategy? How does it relate to our purpose? So I'm going to share here a couple of really good practical resources for governance professionals. You may know about the Canadian Purpose Economy Project, and I'm going to put the links in the chat. They have a couple of really good documents for you to check out. Here is the first one. This is Purpose Governance Guidelines for boards. And here, the second one is their Purpose and Stakeholder Governance Playbook, and that is from last year. So I want to drop that into the chat. Those are great resources for everybody to give you a kind of a step-by-step playbook of where, as I said, in education development, offsites, evaluation, and so on, reporting and information flows, where you can actually embed some practices and policies and processes there. I do think the practices and policies and processes are important, but more important to me is the mindset shift. If you, as the governance professional, remember, you in some ways hold the conscience of the organization, you hold the ethical behavior. If you're thinking all the time of how does this align with our purpose, then that's really going to help get those conversations going. Can we get to the next slide, please, Victoria? Yeah. And this is a question that I ask boards a lot in my consulting work when they're thinking about their work. If our interest holders could see us now. So I mean, your members, your customers, your clients, the communities that you operate in, your employees, if they were flies on the wall of the boardroom, would they see our behavior demonstrating our values and purpose? It's a pretty provocative question. Hopefully the answer is mostly yes, but I find super interesting. And if anybody does ask that question of their board, I'd love you to get back to me and let me know what you learn. So yeah, my final slide for now, Victoria, if you don't mind. Thanks. So this is a model that I've developed to help boards in their decision-making processes. Because some of you will know Matt Fulbrook, who's a governance consultant, thinks a lot of really interesting things about governance. And if you're not following him on LinkedIn, you should be. And what does Matt say? Matt says good governance is effectively creating the conditions for good decision-making. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what is good decision making? What does good decision making look like? And the thing about good decision making is you don't necessarily know that your decision has been a good or robust or a sound one until a lot later. You know, there's an apocryphal quote by, I think, Mao, where somebody said, what are the impacts of the French Revolution? And Mao said, well, it's too early to say. So sometimes you're bored, you're sitting in a boardroom, a decision will be made, and you won't know whether it's been robust, the right decision for maybe a quarter, maybe a year, maybe longer. So I spent some time thinking about what are the lead conditions for effective decision making. So what are the things that boards can control going into a decision to know that their decisions are likely to be well-founded? And so the first one, obviously, boards understanding their role, their duties, their duty of care, their fiduciary duty. The second one, really critical to our conversation here, is being guided by the purpose. The purpose, as we said, the North Star, is where you steer towards. Next, consider who the interest holders are. Balance their needs, because their needs will never be aligned. There's not a decision you can make that will make everybody happy. And finally, comes to the heart of the constructive challenge piece of boards, exploring options, asking good questions, applying your lived experience to make those decisions better. So as you can see, to me, when I built this model, purpose is really a big part of boards understanding their role in effective decision making. And being guided by purpose is one of the ways that boards can have confidence going forward that their decisions are going to be likely to be sound ones in this very chaotic, VUCA, volatile, uncertain, chaotic, ambiguous environment that we all find ourselves in. Purpose is one of the things that can cut through some of the noise and help boards move forward. So that's all of my slides. I hope something there has resonated with you. Happy to take any questions now in the chat, online, or by all means, save them up for the Q&A later. And looking forward to hearing from Annie.
Great. That's a really tough act to follow there, but thank you both so much, Isobel and Shona. You've both framed the why and so what of purpose. So clearly what it matters to organizations and how it shows up in board dynamics. I want to pick up on that and take you into the boardroom from my vantage point as a governance professional. My focus is on what all this actually looks like in practice, how purpose, performance, and people come together in the way we structure agendas, make decisions, and communicate with our stakeholders. I always, like to say, sometimes governance professionals, we're the misunderstood group of professionals from, sitting in the typing pool to who do you support, to people just don't really know exactly what we do. And I always like to say, you know what? I know everything about everything. I know where all the skeletons are, and I also know the laws of Wakanda. So ask me anything. But it's important to note that we're starting to move away from using the term corporate secretary as well. I think we talked about this in our last in our session before with Shona and Isobel, and that's again moving towards saying the governance professional, because we are really advisors to the board and management alike. And we sit in that sort of unique position where we're holding up the, I'm Switzerland flag, because you can't really take sides. You've just got to kind of keep in the middle. And that's always a tough act, right, to have, because in one hand, you're sitting with management who, the CEO who's paying your salary, and then you have the board on the other side wanting to know what's happening. So it's always a balancing act, I find. So I don't know if you both agree, but that's where I sit with that. Anyways, and so just jumping into my slides here, I have spent over 20 years working with TSX listed company, primarily in the mining and resource space, many of them in high impact sectors as well, but also through periods of intense change, heightened ESG expectations, and sometimes real controversy. From that vantage point, I don't see the board as a set of individual experts. I see them as a system of relationships between the directors, management, stakeholders, and the communities around where they operate. When Isobel talks about purpose anchoring long-term value and trust, what I see in the boardroom is this purpose, performance, and people need to show up together in every significant decision. If one of those is missing, you can feel it in the conversation. If one person is really misunderstood or if the board's misunderstood what management is trying to come across, it just becomes the whole meeting is just messy in a way. And with that, I also feel that one of my core beliefs, anyways, is purpose is not a slogan. And I've started to understand purpose so much more in the last 2 years or so when we started talking about purpose governance. And I believe it's the standard we use to judge our choices and our impact. So that's something that I always sort of put in the forefront of my day-to-day work. Go to the next slide. And I speak fast, so please tell me if I need to slow it down a bit. And I know I don't have a lot of time, and I've got a few slides. I want to go through a lot of this pretty quickly. So practical ways that I embed, I guess, purpose in governance is really by strengthening your frameworks. And what I mean by that is I try to weave purpose directly into the board and committee charters, not just in the preamble, but in the responsibilities and the decision criteria. When we review delegations of authority, I always ask the question, where are the decisions that have the largest impact on people, communities, and reputation happen? Those are the decisions that you want to keep closer to the board or ensure there's a very clear purpose lens when they're exercised. I also try to align board skills matrix and succession planning with purpose critical capabilities. ESG, Indigenous relations, human rights, cyber, workforce, and stakeholder governance. If those capabilities are not present or accessible around the table, then you have a gap. So it's really important to sort of keep looking at those your skills matrix and making sure that your board is sort of if there's going to be a gap, you flag that pretty quickly that we have a gap. We need to think about this as we're looking at the next round of recruitment, whatever it is that you'll be doing. And Shona, please feel free to jump in here as well as Isobel if I'm just rambling on here. And then when Shona talked about governance considerations for purposeful decision making, I think this is where I am sort of mentally mapping her points into as I look at my charters. I think what she said there really kind of resonated with me. And so I want to map those points into your charters, I think, and sort of matrices and delegations so that the governance framework itself carries those expectations. I think it's super important that you put it in writing, because when it's not in writing, sometimes people just forget about it. So I think it's important that we take note of what Shona gave us there. And then shaping your agendas. Make deliberate space for stakeholder and purpose related conversations. In my view, that means that it's not tucked under other business at the end of a long meeting. These should be designated into your strategy sessions, risk reviews, and site visit briefs. When major decisions come forward, for example, M&A, large capital projects, closures, restructurings, my job is really to flag that a purpose lens is essential. That might mean the board pack includes stakeholder impacts and scenarios, community and workforce implications, long-term resilience, and not just IRR and PV. I think that's what most of the times people are looking at. But we really need to be intentional and making sure that this is actually reflected in those board packs. Shona described how threading purpose into board education and I think strategic offsites. I think you mentioned that. In my role, I try to ensure that those conversations are then reflected in the forward agenda, which is that the the commitments, intentions identified in those sessions come back as action items and decisions point, not just one-off workshop items that they talked about at their offsite and they just forget about it for, another year. The next thing is just building capability. I think it's super important that we have a purpose-led culture. And what I mean by that is I want to ensure that the board is I think I mentioned this earlier again for management. I mentioned with the board is just making sure when you identify gaps in your skills matrix, on the management side, this can be quite practical templates and checklists for sort of purpose-ready board papers with prompts such as who's affected by this decision and how? What are the long-term outcomes and risks, not just the short-term metrics? What are the ethical dilemmas or stakeholder tensions we should acknowledge? So again, giving the management the tools to be able to provide the board with some of those purpose-driven information that they can actually have that in their board pack, and they're also thinking about that. So it's kind of a full circle where everybody works together to bring this to fruition. For the board, we try to create learning opportunities across committees. For example, the governance committee might learn from the health and safety or the risk committee about how they are framing community or workforce risks and vice versa. So those board reports, the committee reports that go to the board are super important as well, that are coming out of the committee meetings, because not every board member is sitting in each of these committees. So bringing all of that together and bringing it back to the boardroom and ensuring that it still stays on the agenda. Because I think sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, the health and safety and the social committee is the one that is responsible for that aspect of the company. So, we'll just wait on them to tell us what to do. But I think those reports, bringing them in and also inviting the board to attend some of those committee meetings so that they sort of get a much better sense of what's happening. It's also another way of, keeping in touch with the purpose. And I think, I was writing notes here, so I might get this wrong, but I think this is where the work that Shona does on board evaluations and development, I think, becomes very real in terms of that for us as governance professionals anyways. When evaluations surface themes around purpose, stakeholder engagement, or inclusion, governance professionals can translate those themes into concrete plans. Revisions to charters, again, I'm going to go back to this as we carry on. Agenda changes or director education sessions, super important. And director education sessions are you should really bring in the professionals like Shona to sort of speak to your board members. I know, sorry, Shona, I'm going to keep picking on you, and Isobel. But it's important, right? Because it's bringing an outside perspective into the boardroom.
And the truth about governance consulting is often an external consultant, and I utilized this a lot when I was in house. Often an external consultant can make an impact with change board behavior in a way that the internal governance professional cannot, even if they said the same things.
Yeah, no, for sure, 100%. And then I'm going to jump to my favorite one, which is fostering culture in the boardroom. I smile because this is one of those where, I think in my neutral role, I'm waving my flag, Switzerland here. I can model inclusive and respectful behaviors in subtle ways. It's really hard to change people, as you know, but you can try to sort of find ways to bring it in. I do find, and I don't know if everyone agrees, that sometimes board members don't like everything just being thrown at them at once. I think if you embed things here and there and subtle ways that don't necessarily disrupt how people feel or think, because again, feelings are a true thing in the boardroom. I mean, Shona, correct me if I'm wrong, right? There is definitely feelings. It's there, as much as we want to think that, oh no, these are all very seasoned professionals, but everybody has feelings. And I think one of the things I like to do is ensuring that, those quieter directors have an opportunity to speak. I think sometimes there's like 8 board members and there's always the 4 that speak up the most, and there's the one who's in the corner, they're really quiet. Just watch those little subtle cues in the room, because you are in that unique position of noticing some of those things. Some people don't. Bringing stakeholder perspectives explicitly into the conversation. If we had our Indigenous partners or our frontline employees sitting in this room, what might they say? I think that's a super important question to ask yourself. Like, what would they think if they're sitting in this room, or if they were a fly on the wall? helping the chair, and also helping the chair by signaling where we're not hearing the full range of views. I always sit beside my chair and I have a little post-it note and I write notes to him. I think, so and so looks like they want to say something, but they haven't. Or I just write little things. I think this conversation is going on is kind of sidetracked a bit. So just bringing some of those, bringing it back to the conversation that's currently in front of everyone. Not sure if we have a question, but I thought I saw
Yeah,
something.
and if I can just interject, Annie, on that point, you're so right about there's feelings, there's emotions in the boardroom. One of the things I love about governance is it's a very human endeavor. We like to think it's all about policies and procedures and processes and rationality, or at least, some people view it that way. It's not at all. And for me, purpose is part of the acknowledgement of the humanity of governance. And one of my other core beliefs is that everybody who's engaged in governance, board directors and so on, should also get something back out of that. Collaboration, teamwork, a sense of, learning and development, engagement with their community, and having organizations that are purposeful and boards that are driving towards that purpose also helps bring a lot of value to individual board members in terms of living out their values in their life. So I do think it's part of a recognition of the humanity of governance as a pursuit generally.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, part of our job too is to also gently call in some of those behaviors that don't align. You spoke about values earlier. And I think it's calling out some of those behaviors. I'm not saying be confrontation in the meeting. Sometimes I just let it, I sort of either just let it sort of go on, and then later on I'll put a call in and I say, yeah, I don't know, that conversation didn't really land well with somebody, or somebody had, you can see the reactions on someone's face. So call in the behaviors that don't align with your stated values. For example, the dismissive comments, I think those sometimes come up a lot about particular stakeholder groups, or overly short-term language about issues with sort of long-term human impacts. I know everyone always, we have the human rights assessment and all that, and people tend to say, well, I don't think that really happens, that's not part of our organization. But again, we're sitting here in the boardroom. What happens out there is completely different. So let's not be dismissive about, call out those behaviors, and pick up the phone, call the board member and say, listen, I think that conversation didn't land well. I do that with management too. I say, listen, I think when you said this, that didn't land well with other people. You might have to call this director and that director because they reacted a certain way. And Shauna's question on, if our interest holders could see us now, would we be demonstrating our values and purpose in boardroom behaviors? I think that is a question that I really hold in the back of my mind every time when I draft my minutes, review board packs. It's a very practical test of whether we're living our purpose or just reciting it. So again, all these things come together. I'll take a quick pause there and see if we have any questions or comments before I move on.
Be shy, everyone. And I think, Annie, you're forgetting one thing that I think is so sweet that you do. And you have a hand gesture for it too. So as a board professional, what is your favorite hat to wear?
Oh boy. I think my favorite hat to wear is, again, like I said, I sit in the room. I like to people watch. I always like to watch the reactions of people, and how, again, it's if you do take a moment to just sit back in the meeting. Look, sometimes we're just there in the meeting. We don't really have a big role to play unless it comes to your section on governance, then you're speaking out, but you really have that unique opportunity of helping management understand the board, because sometimes these two don't really understand each other, because the board is just is here on their oversight, and then sometimes they do tend to try and get in the weeds, but you do have that unique perspective of just watching the room and then sort of guiding everyone on where they go. That's why I said I like to be that quiet, reflective person at the same time, and just help everyone come together.
Very good. Very good. Any comments? Any questions? Kind of a quiet bunch. If not, I have loads of questions and I'm well known for all my questions.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um,
I do have one more slide, I think, which was kind of a
oh,
case
okay,
study, but
please.
I just wanted to take a moment there to see if anybody had any questions before we went in there into that sort of case study, so we can look at that. And as I mentioned earlier, much of my experience is in mining and other resource-intensive industries. You, I think we have many stakeholder groups with different expectations in that workers and unions, local and indigenous communities, regulators, investors, shareholders, NGOs, and just the wider community at large. So the governance challenge is to balance the short-term pressures, production costs, market cycles with long-term commitments, safety, climate, communities, and inclusion as well. Um, how do you use what I call the governance levers, or how I use governance levers rather, is in that context. Um, Board papers. We require sort of measure investments and risk decisions to articulate people and community impacts alongside the financial metrics. So I would always ask management, if you are a community member reading about this in the newspaper, what would you need to know to trust this decision, for example? That simple question sometimes almost changes what appeared in the deck, because they have to kind of think about it now, like, okay, well, if this gets out, or if we're trying to sell this to the community, how are they going to receive that? Um, the other thing that I sort of look at is on the committees, especially risk. Um, I try to make sure that the issues of social license and community impact do not only appear once a year. They're formally tracked as ongoing risks with trend data, leading indicators, and sort of some mitigation plans. So that's something, again, I try to always inform management, like make sure this is in your board papers as well. And each quarter, if you have quarterly meetings, I know everyone's different. Some people have quarters, some people just have monthly meetings. So if you have dashboards, I find most boards really love dashboards because they're easy to follow, and they actually show the red light, green lights, you know, and amber. And so that gives them a bit of a visual impact on what they're looking at. Um, and sometimes bring the voice of stakeholders into the room. When we go on site visits, for example, and meetings, we do meetings with community leaders, regular workforce engagement as well. We just let the board sort of, there's a structured site visit, but also when it comes to meals, let's go to the cafeteria where everybody eats, grab a meal and sit. Don't just sit together again, just spread out, talk to the workforce, and you get to hear, you know, what's on their minds. And I find that when we do those types of site visits, those are received really, really well. I mean, there's always a sense of like, oh, we don't know what everyone's going to say, but you know what, let them hear it, right? Because this is why they're here. Um, and then, you know, again, going back to linking the key purpose with our commitments. So safety, diversity, emissions, community partnerships, link those into your executive incentives and the board dashboard as well. So they're not nice to have metrics. They say alongside our financial and operational performance, they're actually linking to that and make sure everybody understands what that means. Um, I want to pause there because I think Shona, it looked like you had something to say.
Oh, I was just looking, some questions are coming in. So I think we can probably turn to them after. I'll leave
Yeah.
it in Isabel's
Okay.
hands.
Okay. Other than that, I mean, you know, what's changed in the boardroom for me over the last few years? I have to say that I've seen more honest debate and trade-offs when the directors know more about what's actually happening in the company, and particularly after the site visits. That's when you start to really hear the conversations happen. Like, oh, I was walking around and I sat down with a group of people and this is what I heard. So from there, I think they start to get more comfortable and understand what the impacts are either to the community or to the workforce. So there's definitely been a shift after those site visits. And there seems to be greater transparency about where we're struggling, not just where we're succeeding. So that also comes out sometimes when you have these structured site visits and just let everybody sort of mingle around and talk to everyone. And sometimes you find there's much clearer alignment between what we say in our reports and what we're actually doing and what's been challenging management internally, because now the board has a better sense. They've seen it, they've come back, and now they're like, okay, we saw this. And so management, and then they sometimes do have, give management sort of strategies to sort of mitigate any issues that they're seeing as coming up as well. But other than that, I think I don't know if these slides will be up later. I think they will. And if anybody has any questions or comments, they can always reach out to me.
Well, thank you, Annie, and thank you, Shona. Both great presentations. And as Shona said, we do have some questions in the chat already. One from Randir. So how do you exactly soft sell? It's kind of a broad question, but it'd be an interesting one to hear your perspective on, and even what you think soft sell is. Coming from a consulting background, I know it is something different, but perhaps a governance professional, something else.
Well, if I can maybe kick this one off, and then Annie can chime in. I think potentially, I'm just guessing here that Randy is talking about the governance professional. In some ways, the governance professional's currency is influence and persuasion, rather than hard direction. So, but there's a couple of things here. One is, I think we underestimate how much real power, as opposed to kind of influential power, a governance professional has, because the governance professional has the ear of the CEO, they have the ear of the chair, and they are building, that triad is very powerful in terms of what goes on the board agenda and how the board work gets done. And ideally, the governance professional is 1/3 of that group and has 1/3 of the voice and 1/3 of the power, right? In terms of supporting the board. Now, the real world is that doesn't always happen, but for me, when that relationship is really, really working well, that's a triad of equals in terms of like, how do we get the board where we need it to do, where we need it to be, how do we get the board and the leadership team working together? And that would be like, how do we get the board to focus on purpose? So I think there is the governance profession does have real power. But in other ways, if you're looking more about like, how do you persuade a board that purpose is important? Well, I think you need to look at what resonates with your board. Do you need to talk about organizational legitimacy? Because we know that now consumers and members of the public and communities and so on are really looking to organizations to have a purpose. And they are spending their money that way. You can look at, say, in the States, the difference between Costco and Target. When Costco doubled down on its equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts, whereas Target walked away for them, Costco's foot traffic went up. Target's foot traffic went down. So there's lots of evidence you can point to that when organizations stick by their purpose and values, that consumers stay with them. So for example, if that's something that resonates with your board, then you could try using that as one of your levers. Or talking about, if one of the things that's going on with your board is there's too much business, we're spending too much time on compliance, you can talk about using purpose as a checklist, as a test to make sure really material stuff gets to the board. So I would say that there's, one, you do have as an in-house governance person, you have actual real power in getting things on the board agenda and in the way that the board deals with agendas. And two, you can just generally, in terms of influence and persuasion, figure out what's important to people and then use those levers. But Annie, it's probably got other thoughts.
Yeah. So I think we're on this. So how do you exactly soft sell? I think I mentioned this before. It's just, it's quietly including, not even quietly. I think if you have purpose and values, each company has a purpose and they have their values. I think bringing those up at every meeting as well and looking at them, and just making sure that everyone's still focused on those, that's the best way you can do it. And again, I think Shona, you mentioned as governance professionals, we have the power to get things on the agenda. and bring them forward. And again, this is where also your action item lists after your meetings are super important, because sometimes those action lists are your best friend, because you can bring something up and say, further to the last meeting, we heard this, this, and that. And so we're bringing this back here, just to sort of touch back on that point that was made. And so you're constantly soft selling. I think it's not a one-time thing, but you're constantly bringing the conversation back. I also find other things that I use for soft selling is white papers or articles that come out. I always put at the end of each board agenda reading materials, for your reading pleasure. Sometimes I just email them as they come in. I say, oh, I found this article really interesting. Here it is. And again, it relates to either something that has come up in the boardroom or something that you just feel the board should be aware of as a trend. So you're always soft selling. You're always constantly bringing things up. I always say one of the things as a governance professionals, we're always reading. You always have to read. We're always learning. Something comes up. But my husband's always saying, why are you always reading stuff off your books? I'm like, well, it's an interesting article. But, we learn something new every day. And you will find that, sometimes when these articles are put out, or even by the law firms, they put out trends and things like that. Again, you're soft selling. Send it off to them. Oh, these are the trends that are happening, and particular page 74, there's something for the mining industry or whatever industry you're in, just flag things for them to read. And you'll be surprised the number of directors that actually read all of that. There's a question here, which is always near and dear to my heart, that I want to go to. Besides law as a background, are there any other career paths into this type of profession? Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think I find that unless you're a lawyer, or in Canada, I don't think you necessarily need to be a lawyer to become a
Nope,
government.
I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, neither am I. We have law backgrounds. I have an LLM and Masters in Law, but a lot of people actually kind of land into these roles. I think it's and especially if you're in the mining space, if you're a junior mining company, they'll say, oh, we need somebody to be the corporate secretary. And you know what? Put your hand up. Sometimes you learn a lot just by sitting in the boardroom, right? And I think a lot of us just land into these roles, but I think most people go for either paralegal or law clerks. Business administration is another avenue as well, if you have a business admin background. But again, it's constantly learning. There's a lot of different courses that are given by CGIC as well. I think Governance Professionals of Canada has that. Different avenues. Again, it depends on what you're interested in.
Yep, I'm not a lawyer. I have no law background. My academic background is in pure mathematics, and then I worked in Parliament for 10 years. So yes, I think people fall in. I think anybody who's interested in taking a leadership role, who's curious and strategic, can make a success of it.
Absolutely.
And I'm commencing my board journey at present, and have been for the last couple of years. And I come from a geography and public policy background, and I got into the world of sustainability, and just have realized now that in the space of ESG, so that shift, there is this growing need to understand the environmental and social issues and to ground them with governance. So that's sort of my interest. I don't necessarily see myself yet as a governance professional, but I certainly will be looking at those designations. I mean, who doesn't want more letters after their name?
Yeah, that's great. And then this question I have a question about talking to others after a board meeting that is management. The appropriateness of doing that to be different for an outside consultant versus in-house.
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Yeah,
Jennifer, I don't know, are you able to come off mute and give us more background on that?
Are you with us? Is she gone?
Yeah, she's gone.
Oh, okay. Well,
so
that's too bad. Maybe you can reach out to, I don't know, Victoria, if you can reach out to her afterwards and say we didn't understand the question, but perhaps she can elaborate.
Oh, wait.
We do have a question from...
She's
she's
able
here.
to... Yeah, there we go.
There she is.
The window just popped up that said unmute, so there's a bit of delay.
Yeah.
But thank you for answering the question. It popped into mind when Annie was speaking about how she would often talk to management after the meetings to tell them that something didn't land right, or maybe that they needed to follow up with a particular individual, and also talking about helping management prepare their board reports. So what I'm pursuing is offering governance as a external consultant. And I'm wondering what the appropriateness of reaching out to management would be if you're an outside consultant, and if that is different from if you were an in-house corporate secretary. Like, is it appropriate to do as an external consultant?
Maybe I can take this one. Jennifer, it really depends on the engagement, I would say, because I've been I was in-house for, 20, 30 years, and now I'm an external consultant, and it hugely depends on the terms of the engagement.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. So there would be cases when it was appropriate, and there would be cases when it's not, and it depends on your relationship with those people. I'm happy to have a further conversation with you afterwards if you want to get in touch.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Okay,
I'll drop my email address in the chat in case anybody wants to has particular questions that I think are more like about consultants, which is probably not of general interest to everybody on the call.
Yeah.
So
And then-
moving on, we do have a question from Eugenia. So what other areas will make governance professionals more marketable? For example, certifications in HR or leadership, maybe ESG. I can speak to that, but anything, your thoughts, Annie, Shona?
I think it's, you know what, it's a tough one to say what makes you more marketable. I think it's more, again, take some of those certification courses. I know they're not cheap either, but I think part of it is really just honing in your skills and knowing what's in the boardroom. It's a tough role to market. I don't know. I'm struggling with this one a bit on what I can give you as practical examples. I think also just staying abreast of situations that are occurring in the world. There's the GPC.D certification. I think CGIC has one as well. You could do that. And again, it's just, most of it is just experience, honestly. I think if I'm not, yeah, Shauna.
I mean, I agree with you. I think everything in the organization is the business of the governance professional, which means that nothing that you learn will be wasted.
Yeah.
There are specific governance designations through CGIC, through Governance Professionals of Canada, through the Institute of Corporate Directors that are always worth pursuing. But how that translates into hiring, it's a small profession, right? So sometimes there's an element of luck as well.
Yeah, it is. And everybody knows everyone. And once and again, make sure that you keep your board members apprised of some of these things, because they're the ones that actually will help you along the way as well. But like, you know what? I know of a great corporate secretary, and she's looking now, and it's always word of mouth sometimes I find with this, and just how many people you're connected to. So make sure that you keep former and not ex, but former board members in your Rolodex, and stay in touch with everyone. LinkedIn is a great resource as well for just marketing yourself out there.
No, I find as well, just picking up unique skills. Like I'm hearing more and more boards are wanting to learn more about, ethics, but also futurists are becoming rather popular. And I have found too, just on my own board journey, taking short courses just to get a taste up front of what it is. And of course, attending breakfast, lunch, cocktail events, whatever. That's a great way to just get out there and start networking and hearing about the diversity of backgrounds, not only from board directors, but also governance professionals. Now, we do have a question, and it's one that's near and dear to my heart, and it's how useful are grievance mechanisms in supporting board and management oversight of community-related issues and site-level work concerns? Coming from an ESG sustainability background and a huge supporter of business and human rights, today is UN Human Rights Day as well. So very apt question. The grievance mechanism is key in those areas, and the grievance mechanism does feed what goes into the board packages and briefs and so forth. So a strong grievance mechanism, and coming myself from an extractive industry background, is paramount in dealing with social and stakeholder issues and environmental issues. And it does provide those stakeholders with an opportunity to not only raise an issue, but see how the board and, of course, management work their way through. But Shona and Annie, do you have any questions or any comments?
No, I agree with what you just said, and yeah, those dashboards are. I mean, for us coming from myself coming from the mining sector, the grievance mechanisms are pretty prominent in the dashboards. You know, the board does look at those because that's how they can tell or judge whether there's issues that are creeping up. And I did want to add one more thing. I know we're at time. Someone asked about the emotional intelligence aspect of the role. It's super important. I think that's one of the soft skills are super important for a corporate secretary or a governance professional because you're going to be dealing with a lot of big egos in the room, and you'll get yelled at sometimes. And again, you just have to kind of, not yelled at, but it's always, your management would say, well, you're a bit of a roadblock and the board wants to see, but you're in that unique role. So having a really high EQ is super important because you will encounter the different personalities. And again, you have to be able to stand your ground. So having soft skills, I think I would say 70% of the job. You have to really be a strong individual and understand who you're dealing with, because everybody will have a say and everybody wants to have their last, their positions taken into account. So it's super important.
And again, I know we're at time, but that question very much falls in the intersection of the work I do with governance and with workplace well-being. And I'm continuing to do some work on well-being and governance professionals as well. So if that's something you're interested in hearing more about, like, do get in touch or follow me on LinkedIn or because there's more to come on that topic.
There was one practical question, and it's regarding recording meetings with full knowledge and approval of the board. And then there's cloud-based recording services versus just recording on my own device. Again, that came from Jennifer, but I think it's a good one because it brings into the fold the ethics questions. And, we're living in this world that's so technology heavy. And of course, now boards aren't meeting as often in person. So any comments on how you're using not just the technology, but, cloud-based recording systems?
I mean, that's all. I would say that's not out of scope for us today, given that we're over time. But no, don't use cloud-based recording systems would be my briefing. And certainly if you're recording meetings, you must destroy those recordings in the same way as you record any notes and minutes.
Exactly. And I think sometimes it depends on the context. If you're sitting through a 10-hour session that is strategy and stuff, you'd have to either ask the board if you can record it or not. You would never record without asking. It's and I think a lot of people, just from an risk aspect, or not even risk, but from a litigation perspective, if you start recording your meetings, those recordings can become part of
discoverable.
So I highly recommend against it.
Yes, well, purpose behaviors are important too to exhibit. So I think that's all the time we have for today. So the next slide, because I know there's still lots of questions, but basically these are 3 questions to close out this presentation, and a call to action quote: governance isn't just about oversight, it's about foresight, and governance professionals are the compass that keep the purpose at the heart of the performance. So those are the takeaways. And of course, too, most important, the next slide, how to get in touch with us. And this presentation and recording will be circulated. So please feel free to tap into that at a later date. And of course, get in touch with any of us. We're all open networkers. And of course, Victoria is also an open networker as well. So, LinkedIn, email, and, approach us at an event as well. That's always good too. All right. Well, thank you
so much. Thank you both.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Isobel. And thank you, Victoria.
Yes, thanks all. And thank you to the audience, and happy holiday season.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Shona. Thank you, Annie and Isobel. And thank you to everyone who attended today's session. I always love a session that has so many questions that I actually have to cut off the speakers sometimes. Just so everybody knows, any of our members, we do have our AGM later today. So if you haven't registered yet and you want to attend that, make sure to go to the website and register for that. Other than that, the national office does invite you to provide your feedback on today's webinar through the evaluation link. That will be sent tomorrow afternoon. And as the speakers said, the webinar recording and presentation slides will be on the website in about a week. And this is our final CPD session for 2025. So we hope you enjoyed the offerings this year. We will be back in the new year with a new cycle of CPD sessions. So keep an eye out for that schedule. And with all of that, thank you for attending, and we wish you a very wonderful holiday season.